Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion tonight. My name is Nathan Solis. I am the Vice President with SPJ LA. We have a very interesting conversation tonight because we had a pretty interesting primary election this year. I'm pretty sure we're all still digesting. I know the numbers are still coming in and some of the races are still being kind of fluctuating right now. So with that being said, we wanted to have a conversation about how this primary season unfolded. Kate Cagle from Spectrum One News, had the idea to put together a conversation about how this is all unfolded. So hopefully we can have a lively discussion about all of this, and I will leave it to Kate.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nathan. And I think what we were talking about is it is such a crazy time to be a journalist right now. And there are so many factors that journalism school, our professors couldn't even have known to prepare us for. I think really starting with the pandemic in 2020, all of a sudden, it's one thing to put your own personal safety at risk to cover a fire or a late night protest. It's another thing to introduce COVID into the factor. And all of a sudden, we had to be worried about what we were bringing home to our families. And I think anyone also watching the January 6th hearings recently is concerned about the rise of extremism in the country, the politicization, the weaponization of extremism. And then finally, after those mass protests we had in 2020, we've also seen changing postures from police and from elected officials. And so we thought it was just important to kind of have an open discussion around what we're seeing, what we're experiencing, bring people together who can talk about what's happening on the ground and also bring in context, historical context, a legal context. So that was kind of the foundation of this panel that we wanted to put together. And what a rock star panel we have tonight. I'm just so excited. Even if no one showed up and it was just me having an hour to talk to these people, I would be so excited. Of course, we have Professor Jody Armour. He's the Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at USC. He's the author of books with titles I can't say, but he's also a thought leader in Los Angeles and really nationally on the law, language, and politics. We also have Dee Barbadillo. She's a community organizer. She's worked alongside Black Lives Matter LA, the Check the Sheriff Coalition, and the Philippines US Solidarity Organization. She's also part of the National Lawyers Guild, but she's been on the ground for a lot of the political activism that we're going to be talking about today. Jong Park is an LA Times reporter covering Asian American communities. He covered the LA mayor's race, and he recently came back to LA after covering state politics for the Sacramento Bee, and he works at the LA Times. And finally, Carol Sobel, a civil rights lawyer and advocate who has repeatedly sued the city of LA. She has really driven how the city deals with the homeless epidemic and policing and various issues that we all face. So major thanks to everyone on the panel. Thank you for being with us today. And I'm really excited to see the questions that we get from the people who are watching. So please send them in. But first, I want to kind of set the scene. We saw a ton of activism, disruptions around the June 7th primary. And I'm curious to ask the panelists if you had ever seen an election season quite like this. And I'm going to start with Jong Park because he just came to LA from Sacramento, and I'm pretty sure his answer is no. So talk to me a little bit. What was it like covering the mayor's race this time around?
It was a trial by fire, I think is the best way to put it. I mean, covering Sacramento politics and state politics has its own drama. You may remember about 3 or 4 years ago, somebody threw like a menstrual blood into the Capitol, which shut down, I believe, the Senate chambers. So things were crazy, but having said that, I think this election season, there have been more disruptions, there have been more protests, and I think just more anger and frustration at elected officials, especially in the city of LA, that I have witnessed. I will say this is the first LA election that I covered. as a reporter. So, I don't have necessarily a historical comparison that goes back years or decades, but, just as an observer and now as a reporter, I think that's what I've observed. It's just on an unprecedented level of, I think, frustration that, residents have as elected officials that manifested in different ways.
Okay, I'll go to Dee next. As someone who participated in some of that activism, what did you think of this election cycle?
I think it's interesting because I think there's this sort of story that's told that a lot of activists in LA are like Twitter activists who only say things online, only post things online. And then there's so much derision about that. But the truth is a lot of the folks, in LA who were taking that opportunity in open forums to speak up were just sort of reciprocating what they saw coming at them. In the age of social media, a lot of officials and a lot of candidates are trying to be as, in touch with the people as possible. Well, this is sort of, what what you get is you invite folks to come see you, to come speak to you. And if, I don't think a lot of people realize that a lot of the folks who were disrupting were people that didn't just show up one day and decided they wanted to yell. These are people who tried to get sit downs with these officials, who got the runaround. And so they said, okay, I'm just going to take this opportunity. You're in a public forum. I am the public. I'm going to show up.
What about you, Carol?
Well, I actually think that the disruption is good. I think the disruption is almost always the right approach, or a good approach. I come out of 1968 in Grant Park in Chicago, so I am, I have a history of participating in that. And I think what was most amazing up to me about this was how the disruption was responded to, and then how much money can buy. I was a little stunned that we are back to money buying the city hall. And I think people should be out protesting anything they want to.
Okay, Jody, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm agreeing, of course, with Carol that disruption is a necessary tool. We saw it with the birth of Black Lives Matter in 2013-14. The hallmark of their movement was disruption, shut it down, and then let's compel some uncomfortable conversations about systemic and structural racism. And we, had a generational upheaval in the streets here 2 summers ago, and the electorate went to the ballot box and listening to the higher angels of its nature, voted in a George Gascon or Measure J, et cetera. Here, almost 2 years later, a lot of people see folks reneging on those achievements, on those promises, on those commitments, and there's a lot of anger because there was hope, for once, for many people for once, and now that hope seems to be getting dashed when you see people welching on those promises. So yeah, that was my sense.
Well, let's get a little more into like the dynamics of what was happening. Jung, you were at an AAPI forum that essentially was disrupted, but I think that one also was actually also able to go on, correct? Kind of set the scene for us. What did that look like? And what was it like for you as a reporter? I remember watching because you were trying to live tweet what was happening, and then things just started going off the rails.
Yeah, so in the beginning, there were protesters who were especially against Councilmember Kevin De Leon's policy on homelessness. Some of you may remember that he was instrumental in clearing out Tomimi Plaza in Little Tokyo of homeless encampments, and to do a lot of criticism from the advocates. And that led to protesters coming to the forum. They held signs. They, basically just criticized Councilmember De Leon. And then about halfway into it, those protesters actually took to the stage with their signs and disrupted the event. it didn't necessarily get, I think, a confrontational per se, even though there was an incident that I think tweeted a video about where a protester tried to kind of go after one of the official at the forum. But to watch it and to see it, it was very interesting to me because it's something that I thought about for a long time about, is there a right venue to protest and is there not a right venue to protest? And I don't necessarily know if there's an answer to it. And I think a lot of folks here will probably say there is no such thing as the right venue to protest and wrong venue to protest, right? Having said that, I think, I was talking with the organizer of the forum, which was focused on AAPI issues in the LA mayor's race. And she was talking to me about how she was concerned that, the candidates will not show up to another forum like this, focused on AAPI community because of this disruption. And ultimately, it's not up to the protesters to, think about that, because again, the frustration, I think the anger of the protesters have been brewing up for years. Having said that, it is something that I was thinking about as a reporter. Is this going to have an effect of elected officials even more closed off, and not going to those forums or not going to those debates because they're afraid of confrontations? And again, I don't think that's up to the protesters to really think about that, but it is something that I did think about coming right out of covering that forum.
Yeah, well, I think we certainly saw the effect of that. For example, my station's Spectrum, we aired the very first mayoral debate at LMU, which had an audience. In fact, it was supposed to have 900 people in the audience, and it ended up being limited and brought inside, I think, because of the weather. But, that was an hour-long debate, and 20 minutes in the middle of it was all completely disrupted. And the result of that was we saw the following televised debates all of a sudden, started limiting who could attend. By the time you got to the Cal State LA ABC 7 debate, it was not only invitation only, but the leader of Black Lives Matter was physically taken out of the room before the event started, presumably under concerns that the debate was going to be disrupted. So I guess I take that question then to D. Is this something that is being factored in as part of the tactics here?
I think that's interesting because I think that puts a lot on activists to make decisions that really ultimately are up to who are supposed to be these public servants. Part of being a public servant, part of being in public office is being beholden to your constituents. And if your constituents are unhappy and they're voicing it, for that person to sort of run away and cower and hide behind the security protocol is just running away. It's not actually addressing the issue. And so I think we're entering an era, or we've entered an era, or we're, bringing it back, where if people are being vocal about how they don't like what's happening with their elected officials. In regards to the AAPI forum, those protesters were silent. So there was a big uproar by some of the candidates, but it was a silent protest. They sat on the steps in front of the candidates holding signs, not saying anything. If that is scary, a silent protest, then I really don't know what to say to these candidates. And I get it. I am an organizer, I'm an activist, and so maybe I sound biased, but the truth is that's part of the role of a public official, is to respond. And if your response is to cower and hide, well, it's not on the activists to choose tactics that are a little bit more friendly. It's on those in office to actually respond in kind. When I say respond in kind, I mean sit down, talk to these people, or just run off and hide behind security protocol. And I was also there at Cal State LA. The way they limited attendance was ridiculous. I don't even know who was in the room other than reporters from very specific outlets. And that was about it. I mean, Dr. Abdullah is a faculty member there. You would think that she would have been allowed in. And they caused a scene by kicking her out when all she was doing was sitting there and possibly not even causing a scene herself. So again, the onus should not be on those who want to use their voice. The onus should be on those in office.
Well, I'll just say we invited you on for your pro-activist bias. So don't shy away from that. I mean, part of the reason that we wanted to have this was to have kind of an open dialogue, because journalists, activists, and advocates, we all work in the same space. We're not necessarily working together, but we also all work under the First Amendment. So I think it's important for us to have kind of an open dialogue, around our shared values around these things. And Carol, I'm interested to have you weigh in on the limits. Are there limits to free speech here, legally speaking? I think we all know the proverbial, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater, but is there anything legally restricting you from ending a debate with your voice?
I think it is a statute that says it's illegal to disrupt a public meeting. And oddly enough, I litigated a case in federal court on behalf of Pete White from LA Can, who was arrested for, quote, disrupting a public meeting, which was the Central City East people taking business people on a tour of Skid Row to show them how awful it was. We won, but we could not get the statute struck down. We won on the facts of his case. So I can't go out and tell somebody you can win. And this is a really old statute in California. We said, come on, you got to give this one up. It's unlawful. I think that the courts, we're seeing this now. The California Supreme Court actually heard an argument last week about a group of animal rights activists protesting at the home of a corporate business owner on this issue. And I think that the courts are uncomfortable. And I think one reason the courts are uncomfortable is because, and this happened after the killing of the young black woman by the young black girl by the Korean grocer. And Latasha Harlins a number of years ago, and a single protester, an older black man who actually goes to a lot of the city council and county council county board supervisors meetings, he went to protest outside the judge's house, Joyce Carlins, and she immediately got a restraining order. And I think that there is that concern. We got the restraining order thrown out, but there is that concern of safety and this is an ongoing battle about how close can you get to public officials. So I think I don't think the law is certain at this point. And I think that it is, I would not advise anybody that they have an absolute right, because I don't think the courts agree with me.
You're on mute.
Oh, Jody, what do you think?
All right, yes. Wow, it is illegal to disrupt a public meeting. I'm really glad to hear, Carol, that you got my friend Pete White, his freedom maintained, doing the important work he's doing on a grassroots level for folk who are houseless in Skid Row. But I'm trying to, as much as possible, Kate, take a kind of academic scholars approach to this and say, what's the other side? Let me try to understand that some. Are you saying that you want, and we all do want there to be free and open debates. We want to hear all the sides. We want to have an informed electorate, and so you want to hear what people have to say. And so a lot of folks are going to say, well, yeah, that sounds right. And those disruptors are therefore in the wrong. They're the ones who are violating, right? And I think that intuition has to be spoken to. And for me, one way I feel it, because I have a visceral reaction too, the spirit I have is, they're trying to cut through our collective complacency. And sometimes that complacency, if it's about something really intolerable, needs to be cut through, and it can't be business as usual. I'm thinking about, for example, when I first started teaching, Kate, at USC Law School in 96, 7, 8, all the way to 2003, I had to teach that it was constitutional for states to say two couples of the same sex who exchanged intimacy were wicked felons who could be thrown into a cage and locked up for long periods of time, right? We fortunately, when I bring that up to my students, they think that's something that happened 150 years ago. No, that was only 2003, right? Now, if we have some politicians sitting around talking about, well, should we go back to those laws where we criminalize same-sex intimacy? Let's hear all sides. You know, I could understand. I think many of us should understand. No, there are some limits of tolerability. And that's what a lot of people are saying, that we've exceeded those limits of tolerability. Now, we're going to have different ideas about where those limits are, but that's what the real issue is.
Sorry, I hid my own unmute button. Well, and I think, you know, I came across this, I was actually off the week that we hosted that LMU debate, but I turned it on and was literally having a heart attack from my network watching this happen. Even though, I mean, it was, you know, it wasn't a big surprise to us that it was going to happen because we had seen, so, you know, anyone on the ground who covers town halls, city council, like we had seen this repeatedly, and I had seen this technique used at a sheriff's town hall where they stagger disruptions in order to throw off the event. But so for me, I was like, the viewers at home don't know what's happening. So me as a journalist, my response was, I have to cover this. I have to do a story to explain to people what the message is, why it was disrupted. And I think sometimes that's getting lost in LA, is that, you know, journalists, sometimes you do have to bridge that gap and kind of explain to your audience why these disruptions are happening, because, you know, in the context of a live televised debate where the disruptors don't have microphones or cameras on them, it can be a little bit confusing. So now that we've tackled that thorny question, the next thorny question I want to talk about is, who is a journalist? And this is something that's going to be really key in Los Angeles. You know, the Journalism Coalition worked really hard to get SB 98 passed into law that exempts journalists from unlawful assemblies. The big question is going to be, you know, who is that law protecting in this kind of environment where anyone with a cell phone and a Twitter feed, is that press, is recording? If you're at a protest or a disruption and you're simply recording what's happening and publishing it to a feed, is that enough to qualify you for press protections? Let's start again with Carol. What do you think?
So I have a slightly different view than you might expect on this. I think the free flow of information is really important. And although I understand the role of the press in the past, I think in the modern times, the person with the cell phone can be just as important, and I want them to be able to stay and observe. You know, the most obvious example of where this critical resource falls is George Floyd. We would know about George Floyd, but we would not have had the global reaction that we had if that young woman hadn't been there with the cell phone and been allowed to stay. So in California, we have a law, PC 148. It's, you know, it doesn't necessarily cover the unlawful assembly, but it says you can videotape the police, and you can't be arrested just for videotaping the police. I feel like this is going to be like Pete White's night. I represented Pete White on these kinds of charges too. I've represented Pete White a lot, but you know, this is really critical. It could be any member of the public, because the press is limited in number, and you're not always in the right place at the right time. And so I really want to see these rules be much more expansive, so that any member of the public can stand out of the way, as the press must do. They have to stand back as well under the Crespo settlement, and be able to document what's going on. The other thing is, so many people have have websites and act as citizen journalists. And so the question is, do we want a distinction in terms of rights between people who have a credential from the LA Police Department or the LA Sheriff's Department? Is that the deciding line? I don't think it is anymore.
Yeah, okay, I'm gonna do a very brave thing and I'm gonna attempt to share my screen and show a video. So we'll see if it works out. Let's see, can you guys see my messy desktop now? And I wanted to show this video.
Get away from the snitch. Space, so I need to have who's never been great. Get away from the snitch.
He's fake. Yeah, he's not Ellie. He's fake. Yeah, he's fake.
Stand away, dude. Just stand away. You said your friends.
I'm not gonna have you talk to the cops and lie about me.
Come on, dude. You sat there and called them all.
I sat there and called them? Absolutely not.
I mean, don't even bother with it. He's irrelevant. Nobody listens.
So it's a little hard to tell. So that was a video of a campaign event from just a couple weeks ago. It was taken by a journalist, Johnny Peltz, with Knock LA. It's of actual campaign manager for the sheriff calling him a snitch for reporting on a public event by a public official and saying that he doesn't qualify as press. And it was just, I felt like kind of encapsulates a lot of the dynamics that are happening right now in the city, including where a lot of us, even, you know, me, like I work for a major cable news station, but oftentimes I'm just filming on my cell phone. So it really showed to me some of the tension that we're seeing around people who are trying to dismiss people who are there to be as press, to say that, you know, they don't count. And I'm interested in, maybe let's have Dee weigh in here, if you have seen any of that happen or how the dynamics have changed out on the ground.
I have seen the dynamic change so quickly in just the past 2 years. I have had the privilege of being on the ground with a lot of folks, a lot of photojournalists, a lot of journalists. We tend to stand in the same spots. And I think what's interesting is that I think police are starting to reckon with the fact that they're not, police and public officials are starting to reckon with the fact that they're not always going to get reported by the people they know. You know, there's these gonzo journalists, street journalists, people with cameras, and they're catching everything. You know, you can easily not have been at an action, but get a camera angle from 5 different views and know exactly what happened. And I think what's happening is public officials and police seem to be clinging to the idea that a true journalist or a journalist that fits their idea of what a true journalist is somebody who is categorically unbiased, who comes from an outlet they recognize, has a press issued badge, right? But that's not the case anymore. And in fact, it seems a lot of people are not opting to get those LAPD or LASD issued press badges because 1, they're hard to come by because police are being quite selective, and 2, because they don't need it for the work that they're doing. And I think so long as that is the image of what a journalist is to public officials and to police, they're going to cling to the idea that if you stray from that small box, that small narrow definition, that you're not press. And I've seen it time and time again. You know, there's a lot of news outlets that do such important work, but they're not, you know, they're not as quote unquote buttoned up as the established, you know, news outlets. You have, you know, LA Taco, Knock LA, they don't have all the same resources, but they're doing good work and they're doing work that's getting noticed. And I think now they're being targeted as being not real press. But it's interesting because, you know, what constitutes real press. Like if somebody is left leaning or right leaning, but they actually work for an outlet, they're still press. I think, to me, and this is just a personal definition, as long as you're not interacting with police and public officials in a way where you become the story, where you're yelling in the sense like you're causing the disruption yourself, then I don't think it has to be such a strict definition of what press is. And also, you know, we could talk about it later, but, you know, Lex from LA Taco was the person at the center of, you know, controversy on how press have to or don't have to identify in LA. I don't know if people know that story, but at the Dodgers celebration after they won, a sergeant, even after he showed his press credentials, his LA Taco press credentials, knocked him down to the ground. He had equipment on him. They ruined his equipment. And later on, LAPD went on to say that now press only have to self-identify. So I think it's an interesting dynamic that's been changing. Sorry to be long-winded.
No, I think you brought up some really good points. John, I'm interested in hearing you weigh in, especially because you came from Sacramento. What have you noticed as far as press access in LA?
So I don't have a LAPD or LA Sheriff press pass, and a lot of LA Times reporters actually don't have a press pass. For me, part of it is practical. I just got here. It's been month 5. And much of the time has been kind of spent, you know, inside because of COVID. So there was that. But also, I agree with you in a sense that I don't think LAPD or LA Sheriff should decide who gets to be journalist. I mean, we cite the work of NARC LA, LA Taco all the time. As an Asian American community reporter, I read a lot of ethnic media that cover LA and that cover, frankly, stories that either we think are too small or we think are not as important, but are still news that are very important for different communities. And they don't get recognized by LAPD or LA Sheriff because, you know, how many people know Radio Korea? How many people know, you know, LA? I think LA Sentinel, people know LA Sentinel because it's been such a big presence in the Black community. But, you know, how many people know the World Journal who covers the Chinese community, right? So I think for all those reasons, I just don't think it makes sense for the, you know, LAPD or LA Sheriff to decide, you know, who gets to be press or who gets to be reporters. I will say, you know, I was at the Super Bowl celebration after the Rams won. I was with Kevin Rector, who covers LAPD for us, covering the events in downtown LA. And, you know, we did observe that LAPD was better when it comes to giving press more access. And it didn't necessarily just apply to us as a LA Times reporter, but also other press covering the celebration. So hopefully that's a good news, even though, you know, the nature of, I think, the protest against police brutality is different from a celebration after a football game. So you never really know whether those kind of more access will really stick for the protest. But, you know, the hope is that LAPD and LA Sheriff and authorities will be more respectful of the police, the press's right to cover and to write about those events as much as possible. I will say, you know, the one thing that I did think about is I also covered, you know, quite a few anti-lockdown, anti-mask protests when I was working as a reporter at the Orange County Register back in 2020. And I did see some folks who basically use camera and who use the phone as a way to intimidate the counter protesters against the people who are opposing lockdowns. So people who are, you know, supporting the mask mandate, for instance. They, you know, I talked to some of them who felt intimidated by, you know, the phone cameras, who, you know, who posed as quote unquote journalists, but who were really there to just intimidate, you know, the people who went there to counter protest. So it is something that I do think about. You know, my personal belief is that the definition of press should be as expansive as possible for all the reasons that I outlined, but also, you know, when is there are some limitation as to, you know, when is the line crossed in a way that gets to be threatening, and not in the sense that you're filming the police and filming the authorities who, you know, need to be held accountable, but you're filming like regular folk who are there to, you know, protest for their safety, right? So it's just something that I've been thinking about quite a bit, I would say.
Yeah, I figured that this would come up, and I think most of us know this, even, us reporters who kind of grew up with this notion of objectivity being, essential to our careers. I think it's pretty well known. I mean, I knew even when I was in journalism school, like, you can't find a tweet from me like expressing an opinion ever. But this would be kind of unrecognizable to the people who wrote the First Amendment. I mean, during the founding of this country, all press was partisan. It was all politically funded. In fact, I wrote down his name because I wanted to have it. James Thomas Callender was known as a political scandal monger. And he was the first person to ever publish that then President Jefferson had children with one of his slaves. And that these were the people who were really shaping the ideas around a free press, and they weren't objective at all. So now when I hear people who are in seats of power trying to use objectivity as, a litmus test of whether someone qualifies to cover a press conference or a political event, it's just kind of crazy. But we are seeing them use political officials use other ways to try to avoid confrontation. Now it's become infamous in the mayor's office that they might not release until 6 a.m. that morning what events they have during the day, even if it's an 8 a.m. event. And that's affecting all of us, our ability to cover things, unless you're a big outlet that has a 24/7 desk that is taking in information and can assign people in the middle of the night. So it definitely has had an impact on everyone. I'm curious, it's been a minute since we've had Jody weigh in. I didn't know if there was any points you wanted to make about objectivity or access.
Well, I'll just say a few things real quickly, because I've been thinking about this problem of what constitutes a journalism. Carol talked about Darnella Frazier, the young woman who recorded George Floyd's last moments, and going back to Annenberg, Kate, School of Journalism, Alyssa Richardson, professor over there, has written a book about how you have to start rethinking what constitutes a journalist in light of Twitter and telephones and photojournalism and all of that sort of thing. So one thing is for sure, it hit me as I was kind of trying to think this through and get ready for this, was that the First Amendment is meaningless if it only protects people that the government recognizes as journalists. It's meaningless, right? Press freedoms belong to everyone, not some select group of privileged, kind of citizens we call journalists. If we empowered police and prosecutors to decide who does and doesn't deserve press freedoms, that's going to restrict freedom of the press, right? To a small cloistered group, some kind of priesthood, because now they have to be designated journalists by the very people they're supposed to be watchdogging, right? And how's that likely to work out? The First Amendment was written precisely to avoid that danger. That's the very risk. So unlike lawyers and doctors, we have a great school here, Annenberg, and on the other side of the country over in Philly, where I love to, at Penn, they have another school, great journalism schools, right? But unlike doctors and lawyers, journalists are, a journalist is not some licensed kind of credentialed, title that only a small privileged set of people have or can legitimately lay any kind of legal claim to. It doesn't have those kinds of professional requirements. There's, the state doesn't license who is and is not a journalist. The opposite is true. And anyone can be a journalist, regardless of education, credentials, employment status. All you have to do is inform the public about newsworthy matters. And the sole requirement then to be a journalist, is to engage in an act of journalism, which is in turn is best defined as reporting to the public of events in the public interest, right? And particularly when those concern public officials who don't want that information getting out, or don't want the scrutiny, or don't want the reckoning. In a 1977 SCOTUS opinion, which really kind of documented the limitless scope of the constitutional free press guarantee, Chief Justice Warren Burger, right, wrote, quote, "In short, the First Amendment does not belong to any definable category of persons or entities. It belongs to all who exercise its freedoms," right? That's what a journalist is.
With that being said, I think you're the perfect setup to this other clip I wanted to show. So here I go again. You guys can see my screen, right?
Joe, you're right off like usual. You're out the door. Pulling at 1%. You're pulling at 1% and you keep running away from the people that you're trying to represent. Joe, you got anything to say to that? And you voted for TVTP, didn't you? Didn't you? Did you vote for TVTP, yes or no? You can't even answer that question. Look, no, I'm asking him. You gotta go? 1%. Don't touch me, Gabby. Don't touch me. You fucking touch me. You fucking touch me. I got you on the camera. 1%, Joe. 1%, Joe. I'm stronger than you too.
Are you gonna push on me? You're gonna push on me? I'm a woman. You're gonna push on me?
Gabby, what are you doing? Why are you protecting me? You gonna go work for Caruso after this? You gonna go work for Caruso after Buscaino pulls out of the race? This is 1%. Unfortunate the AAPI community wants. Is it so unfortunate? So why are you walking out? Why are you walking out? Why are you walking out?
Okay, I'm not gonna get in the elevator with him yet.
Out of the elevator now. Get out. What? Who are you? Get out. Who are you? Get out. Who are you, Joe? Who are you, Joe? Who are you? You're a reserve fucking cop. Thank you so much. Get out. No, I don't need to get out anywhere.
Go, Joe.
Again, 1%, bro. You pulling at 1%. What are you even still showing up to these things for? You stealing people's money? Stealing people's money to go on vacation? Oh my God! A job. I actually work for the community, right? Yeah, this is really bad. Look at you, 1% Joe. 1% Joe. Joey Buckets. Joey Buckets.
So when we were working on this panel and I saw this clip, it really stuck out to me because, you know, Jason, he's with Stop LAPD Spying. He's definitely an activist, but a lot of what he's doing in that clip certainly looks like journalism to me. He's asking questions of a public official who certainly seems like they don't want to answer them. And I think if you see someone who is called an investigative reporter doing the same thing, that they have certain protections. So anyway, it was just interesting to me because it looks a lot like journalism. I don't know if anyone particular on the panel would want to weigh in on that. Just as, you know, Jody was talking, journalism is an act, something that you're doing and not just something that, you know, is. And I see one person weighing in who's pointing out, well, the activist is calling him names. That's not something you would certainly normally see a reporter do. I know, Carol, what do you think?
Well, you know, I'm not sure if it's journalism or not journalism, but it doesn't look a whole lot different than when credentialed journalists follow elected officials down the halls of Congress trying to ask them a question. We see it all the time. We see them following them to the elevators. We see the exact same thing. We see their staff intervene. So I'm not sure why it's different or why it matters if he is officially a journalist, because, you know, and I guess, you know, people might look at it and say, well, how many times can you call him 1% Joe? And does that add to the dialogue? But that's not our decision. That's, you know, it just seems to me that that person had the right to go into a public building, to follow Joe Buscaino, to ask him those questions, even if it became, you know, extraordinarily repetitive. And I think that some of it is probably informative. I don't find all journalism informative, you know, but I think to some people that may be. And I guess the question is, do we need to, if it's a First Amendment protected incident, an exchange, does it matter if we have to call it journalism or not?
It's interesting. There's lots of opinions in the chat, so I'm going to read some of them. Rebecca Aguilar, she's the president of SPJ National, says journalists do not have to bully or verbally abuse anyone when getting an answer. These were bully tactics. Journalism is pursuing information, not attack, not our job. Lionel Mares says, I've studied these video footage, and after a while, the politicians will get upset. They resort to aggressive like behavior, like when Gabriella tried to grab someone's phone. It's human nature to get upset. Laureen says, asking questions repeatedly and assertively is one thing, name calling is another. And I cannot stand Joey B. That's the mayoral candidate in the video. Rebecca Carroll, yes, we do pursue politicians, but we do not bully, abuse, or create a hostile situation. Our job is to get answers, not call people names. That's not journalism. SPJ Code of Ethics, minimize harm. Any other panelists want to weigh in?
I think this is interesting. And again, I'm not a journalist. I know this. So I don't have the training. I don't have the background. But as somebody who consumes everything that journalists put out there, I think it's interesting because, you know, I grew up on 60 Minutes in 2020, and they'd have, you know, like the investigative journalists are doing just that. I did see that, following them down the halls, following them outside their homes, you know, like repeatedly asking a question. And I'm seeing some of the chat. I get it. I get that there was a tinge of, you know, not quite neutral, but I think based on this conversation that, you know, it seems like we're really starting to question whether objectivity and neutrality is the cornerstone of journalism, or if it's just something that some folks choose to adhere to. I saw something in the chat that's like, oh, we pursue objective facts. I mean, can you really pursue an objective fact from a politician? You know, the people you're speaking to are going to be biased. So I wonder about that. But in general, I understand that there are elements to this, calling him Joey Buckets, stuff like that, that don't seem quite so neutral. But again, we were saying earlier that journalism, if you really want to widen the scope of what a journalist is, and if it really is about First Amendments, then that's within his right. You know, it's not a fun answer, but there are left-leaning and right-leaning media outlets, left-leaning, right-leaning writers out there. And so if that's the case, then that's the case. I know it's not a popular answer, but I mean, based on what we've talked about before, and as Carol said, as Jody said, engaging in a journalistic act, exercising that First Amendment seems to fall within those categories.
This is why I would say labels matter, just to this extent, you know, because sometimes it can seem just like a label game. Who cares about label? Are we just talking labels, or we're just talking about semantics? Labels matter for this reason. I know with the Julian Assange case, in which he's accused of doing something that a lot of everyday investigative journalists do. You know, you really look at what he's done, and now being accused of violating the Espionage Act, you've seen a lot of everyday journalists do that sort of thing. And one of the ways that he's been attacked is as a non-journalist. Whenever officials want to insulate themselves from, you know, the consequences of, you know, their wrongdoing, information that's come out about their wrongdoing or whatever, they start playing these label games. It's very important to them. He's a non-journalist, so he doesn't implicate the New York Times. Don't worry, we can crack down on him without, you know, getting in the way of you real reporters, right? They're playing that kind of game, and it's one that we should recognize for what it is illegitimate and not founded in the intentions of the founders, you know, the drafters of the Constitution or the courts that have interpreted since its founding.
I like this comment from Chase Beach weighing in. Is there a level at which asking questions in that way makes a person asking the questions part of the story? Which I think, you know, part of the thing, whether or not you're objective, maybe part of being a journalist is trying to be a viewer rather than being a participant in as much as possible. I don't know, Chung, we haven't gone to you in a while. What do you think?
I mean, sometimes I will say that it's unavoidable for journalists to be a part of the story, right? I mean, the good example, obviously, is Arlene, who works for us at the LA Times, and she became a story last month when the Sheriff Villanueva went after her reporting on a cover-up of an incident involving an inmate, from what I know. So sometimes it's just unavoidable, and I think, you know, it's a difficult decision to make as a journalist, you know, how much to be, you know, part of a story and how much to hold back. And I think our rule of thumb is to hold back, but sometimes it's just unavoidable, you know, to be a part of the story. You know, I was going back to this discussion about you know, the tweet that you shared, Kate, and I was thinking about, you know, just kind of what I think about the tweet and the video, and I did, you know, I did wonder if some of my initial discomfort that I had when it comes to viewing the video came out of kind of the nature of the question, perhaps, and I don't know if that's necessarily a fair thing to say to, you know, Jason, who was, you know, filming and asking, but I do wonder, you know, we did a story, for instance, in March, in which Buscaino, you know, was, you know, accused of spending donor funds on, you know, trips to Hawaii and Italy. We ran the story after, you know, looking at the records and doing the documents. And I think it would be a fair game for us to, you know, go to Councilmember Buscaino and ask, you know, why did you do that? Why did you, you know, why does the record show that you spend all this donor funds on family trips to, you know, Italy? I do wonder if that's kind of a bit of a different nature of question than what, you know, the Buscaino was asked at the in that video. I mean, I don't necessarily know, but I do wonder if that initial discomfort that I felt perhaps just came from kind of how the question might have been worded by, you know, okay, Carol, sorry, go ahead.
Carol wants to weigh in.
Well, I guess I have a question, and listening to Zhang and reading some of the stuff in the chat line. So how are you going to define what's acceptable and what's not acceptable? Because that always gets to be a problem. And who's going to define that? Who's going to decide when it crosses the line into bullying, when it's an inappropriate question? You run for public office. This is part of you know, of being a public official. And I remember years ago when the current city attorney, Mike Fewer, introduced some legislation in the city of Los Angeles to eject people from public meetings if they called the public official, you know, if they were rude. I forget the exact word he used. And when I spoke to him about it, he said, well, you know, they called us names. And I said, you know, get another job. Just that comes with the territory. I get called names all the time. I've been called names by just about everybody who's running for public office right now. You know, from Rick Caruso, they may not use my surname, but they talk about me. They talk about the lawyers do the homeless work, the lawyers who do this, you know, it's me. And, you know, and they don't hesitate to do that. You know, it's part of the territory. You're a public figure, you're going to be called names. And, you know, I just think either get a thicker skin or get over it. I'm not saying this is absolutely great journalism, but journalism doesn't have to be great in order to be protected.
Okay, we only have 5 more minutes, and there's one tweet question I really did want to get to really fast, because someone asked me today, and this is something that I see a lot come up around LA Twitter and covering protests. Someone tweeted, how can journalists take photographs/videos of people in public spaces without inadvertently putting activists/advocates under police surveillance? They don't blur faces, and law enforcement keeps surveillance, essentially aiding them. I think most, you know, your bread and butter reporter would say, if you are out at a public event, at a public action, there is no expectation of privacy. And if there's press there covering it, I would advise you not to engage in any behavior you wouldn't want on television or in the newspaper. I don't know if anyone had a different viewpoint that they might want to jump in and share, or I also think that this, I did a lot of research for this panel and I couldn't find any kind of historical comparison where people had expectations for reporters to shield them in public. I think it's a lot, it's very heavy for a journalist even to allow someone to go off the record to imply that people in public, that they should not be shown doing what they're doing in public. I don't know, it's pretty astounding to me. I don't know if there's anyone who has a different viewpoint that they would want to weigh in.
I'll just dive in real quickly because I'm typically a free speech fundamentalist. I'm all for free speech. I think that when they crack down on dissidents, they tend to crack down on those from socially marginalized groups. So, I'm really a hardcore free speech person typically. But this, I think, is a little more nuanced than some of those cases, because it does seem like a pretty straightforward and easy case, doesn't it, Kate? That you, as part of the reporting, you're in a public place. But I think journalists have to recognize that the bloated punishment bureaucracy that we have now, and LA, it's over $3 billion budget a year we're putting into it. It has a surveillance arm. And that surveillance arm is being used against protesters, community of color, marginalized communities. And sometimes they're drawing that information that they're using to surveil and go after people from the reporting of journalists, right? And so I recognize you're like, yeah, you're doing what you should be able to do, but I'm just saying, recognize that you are also becoming and you are an instrument of perhaps government oppression. I don't know that solves anything. It just complicates it some.
Well, that was the kind of panel we were looking to have, and I think we certainly accomplished it. It's just about 8 o'clock, so I want to wrap things up and say thank you so much to everyone for coming on, for everyone who are watching and really engaging around some of what we like to call thorny questions that don't have easy answers. And I especially think, look, and I say this a lot, I feel like there are people who have been journalists for a very long time, and they were part of an atmosphere where there were multiple daily papers in LA and big staffs and competition among even the broadcast stations that really doesn't exist anymore after we've seen so many job loss, consolidations, and really technology is changing everything, including who is a reporter, the way that people are getting information. And I just thought that it was good to have a really good dialogue around all those issues. I'm going to send it over to Ashanti, who is our SPJ LA president, to see if she wants to wrap it up or add anything to the conversation.
Hello. You actually caught me in the middle of putting down a child, but I'm going to multitask. I wanted to say thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. We hope that you at least got some perspectives maybe that you weren't expecting to hear. I know maybe everything you heard you may not have agreed with, but I think having these open conversations are so necessary so that we can at least see the point of views from folks who may not think like us. And so I hope at least that you can appreciate that we did have this forum to be able to share these different perspectives and at least come to an understanding of how other people may look at this issue. And so I hope that this is something that you did enjoy. I will remind you, we did record this, and so we will be posting the video for this event, both on our website and pushing it out on social media. I also want to encourage all of you, if you enjoyed this event, and if you would like to attend more events that SPJLA is hosting, we encourage you to follow us on social media at SPJLA. We also encourage you to join SPJLA and join SPJ National if you haven't already. So if you go to our website, spjla.org, right on the homepage, there's a join tab that you can click on and join us. We would love to have you. We would love to have you involved. So again, thank you everyone so much. I want to thank Kate for moderating. I want to thank all of our panelists this evening for being here. Dee, Carol, Jody, John, thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time and sharing your perspectives and having a great open conversation and discussion. And I really hope that all of you have a wonderful evening and a safe week. Obviously, there are probably going to be more protests and more and more different events on the ground that we all have to cover alongside journalists and activists. So hopefully this will give you some perspectives to put in your toolkit as we move forward and cover LA. So thank you all again so much, and I hope everyone has a great evening. Good night.
Thank you.